So, we will begin this roundtable. According to the Global Peace Index report in 2022, peacefulness is at its lowest level in the last 15 years. UN Security Council, which is the most important institution for peace and collective security, is more locked now than ever, even during the Cold War. And it is really doubtful that the G20 could play a more positive role in the next week. The hopes for a new world order and paciful one vanished. Public opinion, the surge of civil societies on international stage is not necessarily a guarantee for moderation and compromise. And one of the most important questions is speaking with the rival is a necessity of a betrayal and how to deal with the others when you are not agree or when you are even in position of war with them. How and where draw the red lines during confrontation or even war? Are there common goals which overcome rivalries? Perhaps fighting climate change, fighting terrorism, preventing nuclear proliferation. All these challenges are not depassed by the present situation, rivalries between US and China, and the war between Russia and Ukraine. So I will give you 4 minutes, each of you, to assess the situation, and I will after have some questions for you, and the floor will be yours for the last 10 minutes.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here on behalf of the Republic of Kosovo, and of course share our thoughts as well as evaluation of the current situation where, as we know, the entire security infrastructure and the entire security architecture of our continent is under threat because of Russia's unprovoked and illegal war against Ukraine. The very first thing that I would like to point out is that I represent a nation that has been a victim of genocide 23 years ago, but has turned into the biggest success story of Euro-Atlantic cooperation and Euro-Atlantic joint foreign policy. Secondly, given that I represent Kosovo and given that we've gone through horrendous times during the 90s, but which, because of the partnership of the alliances, has led to more peace, to more stability and more security in the Western Balkans, but in Europe as a whole, there are some lessons that we can draw from the 90s in the Western Balkans that could be used for the situation that we are facing today. First and foremost is the fact that appeasement of autocrats, appeasement of genocidal regimes, appeasement of hegemonic regimes never leads to more peace. It always leads to more war. It might change the date, but it encourages more war. It encourages more autocracy, it encourages more destruction, and it encourages more violence. You know, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because in early 90s, some saw Milosevic as the peacemaker. Some thought that only with him peace can be achieved. We know the result. The result was 150,000 innocent people killed in the wars of Yugoslavia. And the lesson is, you can't appease an autocrat. You can't appease someone that has imperialistic and genocidal and hegemonic intentions against its neighbor. Someone that does not accept but continuously denies the existence of its neighbors, as it's happening right now between Russia and Ukraine. The second lesson that we can draw from the situation is that peace is possible, and it can be long-lasting if the aggressor is not rewarded. Because awarding the aggressor, either with territory of the country that it has attacked, or with some other mechanism or measure, would only encourage them to attack others in a few years. Therefore, more problems for peace and stability, more problems for all of us, not just in Europe, but also beyond. The third thing that we have learned is that what is a must, what is a necessity, and what is a precondition for long-lasting peace is dealing with the past, as well as justice. a lot of people talk about the experience between France and Germany as a lesson that we can learn from. Absolutely, I agree. But Germany did a lot. Germany did a lot. It paid a very high price for the crimes that were committed during Second World War. And it is still paying, as we know. Germany never denied its crimes. Germany had a Willy Brandt that kneeled and asked for forgiveness, because that's what a human being does when there are no words to explain the crimes that had been committed against civilians in the Second World War. And of course, justice for the victims is absolutely necessary in order to move on. And justice, or, well, perpetrators need to be put before justice so that we can never see them committing these crimes again and again. It was because these criminals never faced justice in former Yugoslavia that they continued to create more wars and, of course, commit more crimes against innocent civilians year after year. And finally, I would say the lesson that we should draw from is that we should never get trapped in the game of both-sidism. We hear a lot of statements nowadays about how both sides provoke each other, how both sides should be blamed for a war that was absolutely unprovoked against Ukraine. You can never, you should never use both-sidism when there's a clear aggressor and a clear victim, as we had seen in the wars of Yugoslavia, as we see today in Russia's war against Ukraine. And finally, I would say what we can learn from the case of Kosovo specifically is that our strongest power lies in our partnership. Multilateralism matters, but it matters if it's based on principles, if it's based on rules, and most importantly, if it's based on values. We should stand together, but we should stand together to protect values, to protect principles that have the human and the humanitarian intentions in mind, the human values in mind. When what we care about is, of course, protecting civilians, stopping destruction, these are the values that can keep us forward. The same in the 90s, when the war of Kosovo was stopped by NATO, when NATO stopped the ongoing genocide. It was successful because our partnership, the partnership of democratic countries around the world, was based on values, the values of protecting the victim against the aggressor. So let's not forget where our power lies, but let's also not forget that when we sit together in multilateral fronts, values and principles should be what we support and never get trapped in the trap of both-sidism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. President. Mrs. Novak, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity of sharing our ideas and thoughts here with each other. And welcome everybody, and also thank you for the opportunity of offering the chance to speak about our ultimate goal, which should be the peace right now as well. As long as we are in France, we are in Paris, I thought that I would speak French, so if you pardon me, then I will switch to French right now. Donc, merci bien pour l'invitation, merci encore une fois, et
thank you again.
L'occasion d'être ici.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here and be talking about peace, which is, I think, should be for all of us our ultimate goal. I represent Hungary. I am the president of Hungary, that is a neighboring country of Ukraine. This means that not only our neighboring country is at war, and what's happening in Ukraine and Russia's aggression on Ukraine directly affects Hungarians. Why do I say this? Well, because there are 150,000 Hungarians that live in Ukraine,
Donc ça veut dire qu'il y a
So
150 000 Hongrois qui sont aussi
150,000 Hungarians are
directement
also
touchés par la guerre,
directly
entre la
impacted
Russie et
by
l'Ukraine.
this
Donc,
war
et par l'agression de la Russie. Notre
and affected
situation,
by
à
Russia's
cause de
aggression.
cela aussi, est assez délicate et assez difficile.
So
on connaît bien ce que ça
our
veut dire d'être
relation to this war is rather difficult and challenging. We know what it's like to have the war in a country next door to us.
Pour Vosnas, ce que ça veut dire
So I also know what it's like. We know what it's like to live in a war zone, next to a war zone. So for us, peace is important. I'm a president, but I'm also a mother of 3 children. So for future generations, we need to safeguard Europe as a haven of peace. We should do everything we can to ensure peace in Europe and in this zone of conflict. 6 months ago, I was elected as president. I clearly condemned Russia's aggression on Ukraine, and through various means we have supported Ukraine, and our position hasn't changed since. We provide support to Ukraine. We are pursuing efforts to provide humanitarian aid. There are 1 million refugees that have arrived in Hungary due to the war in Ukraine. What I'd like to highlight today, since we are at the Paris Peace Forum, is that for the time being there are factors at play that are going against peace. And I have 10 key points here, 10 key factors that are running counter to peace. And what are the things that we should overcome to guarantee peace in Europe? So the longer the war will last, the harder it will be to install peace. So I think that prolonged conflict will prolong injury and pain and will cause escalation as well. So war must also be must come to an end. So negotiations for ceasefire are lacking.
Quel est le troisième facteur?
The third factor,
il n'y a pas d'intention suffisante et
there's
suffisamment
not
forte
enough
pour assurer la médiation
willingness for mediation between both parties.
Numéro 4.
4,
Une sorte d'agitation basée sur la désinformation
turmoil based
générale
on general
modifie la
disinformation
compréhension
makes
tout en causant
understanding
d'importants dégâts.
difficult and
La
also causes damage.
désinformation
So
comme
disinformation is the fourth point.
numéro 5,
Fifth point,
les provocations
provocations.
rendent très difficile la recherche
intentional provocation makes finding shared solutions difficult. 6, we are facing a nuclear threat, unprecedented since the Cold War. So I think this nuclear threat is also an aspect that's going against the peace process today. 7, terrorism. Terrorism go against us finding a solution. So I think acts of terrorism also threaten the peace process. This also means that
également expérimenté ce qui s'est passé dans le cas
we saw what happened
à l'encontre du Nord Stream
with the terrorist acts against Nord Stream 1 and 2. So these are acts of terrorism.
Numéro 8.
8,
visant l'empêchement de
threats
énergétique et
against energy and food supplies. Food shortages are affecting those that are most vulnerable, countries that are living through difficult times, namely in Africa. There's also no shared vision for the end of this war. We need a shared strategy. How are we going to overcome this situation, and how can we install peace in Europe? Last point, my 10th point, generating tensions and committing atrocities against minority only deepen wounds whilst making it more difficult to understand each other. So it's a very complex situation. For the time being, we haven't really achieved peace, but the reason why we're here today is also because we are trying to overcome this complex situation and these difficulties and try to really engage in a peace process and so that we can really install fair peace in Ukraine and do our utmost to restore peace in Ukraine and safeguard our union, our continent, and make Europe a continent of peace. That must be our ultimate goal. Thank you very much.
Madame la Présidente, bravo pour votre maîtrise du français. Je passe maintenant la
parole à Jean-Marie Guéhenno, well done on your French. Now I'm going to hand the floor to Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who's a professional but also has an academic vision on these issues.
Well, after the beautiful speech in French of the President, I feel I should speak French, but at the same time I was told que je devrais parler anglais. So I'm divided. I should do my simultaneous translation, but whatever. No. I live between two continents. I live between the United States.
There is a translation.
Yes, good. I live between the United States and France and Europe. And I think that if there is one global phenomenon today, is the closing of the minds everywhere, where people maybe because they are scared of a big world that they cannot control, they retreat to the structures they are familiar with. It's a family, that's a good thing. It's also the nation, which is a good thing only up to a point. Because the paradox is that today we have many problems, and we see it at the Paris Peace Forum, that indeed cannot be addressed by a single nation, even the biggest ones. Neither China nor the United States can handle climate change, can handle many of the issues that are with us today. And then comes war. Comes war in Europe that was proud that it had not known interstate war. It had known, of course, the tragic wars of the ex-Yugoslavia, but it had not known interstate war since 1945. And there comes a violation of the most important article of the UN Charter, the article that really specifies that you can use force only in self-defense. And Russia attacks a country. Certainly it's not self-defense under any circumstance to attack another country that does not attack you. And so what do we do with that? How do we return to peace? I think you have to start from first principles. If you do not agree on some basic fundamental principles, like the fact that you don't use force except if you are attacked, you're not going to have any sustainable peace. And so, at the moment, it's very important that the Russian aggression against Ukraine fail. Because if it did not, it would be a terrible example, not just for Europe, but for the whole world. And in that sense, what is at stake is not just European security, it's the security of the world. At the same time, we need to maintain, and this is the title of this panel, Coopérer malgré la guerre. We need to maintain some common ground. The first common ground, I said, is basic rules, which make the world predictable, which build a measure of trust, never complete trust, but a measure of trust. If you don't have that, you have nothing. But here we are. So what can we do? I think the fabric of society matters. I think it's important to maintain human contacts with Russian society. Russian society at the moment As in many countries, there is a clampdown on media, on the independence of the media, and so that's a very dangerous path to take. Thank God, it's very difficult to prevent a country from accessing information. So we have to make every effort so that Russian society knows what happens and not just watching Russian media, which are at the moment complete propaganda. I think that's essential. I think we need to maintain human contacts as much as possible. And of course, we have to be careful, because in these human contacts, you can have spies, you can have people who are bought, you can have all sorts of bad things. And there are many of them. But at the same time, you can have intellectual, artistic contacts that matter a lot. And that is part of keeping the connections with the society. Then there is the issue of economics and trade. I think there we see clearly that there is a strategic use of trade. Europe was foolish to become so dependent on Russian gas, and it's important to wean ourselves out of that kind of dependency vis-à-vis Russia or other countries. We don't want to be dependent on a particular country in a strategic way. That is dangerous. So we need to have a strategic vision of trade, and I think in that respect, the fact that the European Union, in spite of all its differences, managed to agree on a number of measures is an important signal. I think that needs to be kept, and economic statecraft is less violent than military action, so it's an intermediate step that the Europeans have taken, and it's a good step. And then we have to hang tight and hope with those contacts gradually, and a changing situation on the ground, which at the moment doesn't look very good for Russia, there will be an opportunity for negotiation. We are all for negotiations, but not negotiation at any price. We want negotiation that will restore the fundamental principles that were violated in 2014 and then again in 2022 in February. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Mrs. President, you have said that the aggressor must not be rewarded. Do you think that peace is possible without punishment? Do we need to punish the aggressor, or otherwise no peace is possible?
Well, I believe that, just like for the other questions, history teaches us also on the one that you just posed. And that is, if someone commits genocide, if someone commits war crimes, if someone commits crimes against humanity, and no justice is delivered for these crimes, we are condemned to see them repeated. So I wouldn't call it a punishment. I would call it a justice. We need not just peace, we need just peace. It is extremely important that the lessons that are drawn from these horrible experiences. Is there a peace possible
with Putin at power?
I think Putin must lose this war. Ukraine must win this war. Ukraine must be given the weapons that it needs to win the war, because it will win it not just for itself, but for all of us. And once Ukraine wins this war, I believe Putin will not be in power any longer, and that would be the best also for the people of Russia, but certainly the best for everyone else living in Europe as well as the rest of the world, and then peace would be possible. But peace, of course, can happen once Ukraine wins the war.
Thank you. Mrs. President, Madame la Présidente, vous avez parlé d'une paix juste.
Mr. President, you talked about peace and about justice. What would peace look like between Russia and Ukraine? Well, I think that it's one of the more difficult questions to answer. What does fair peace look like? Now we're on November the 11th, an important day for France and for Europe at large, and an important day for us also in Hungary. And more than 100 years ago,
ne pensaient pas qu'il était juste
there was a peace, but a peace that was not fair. We lost 2/3 of our territory because of the peace agreement that was brokered. So from our perspective, that kind of peace was not fair. But who am I to define what fair peace should look like? But I agree with what you say. We need to have peace, and it needs to be fair. But it's a very difficult balance to strike. And again, I agree with what was said earlier. I believe that Russia needs to understand that a sovereign nation, that a sovereign country cannot come under attack or cannot attack another country without there being any consequences, neither today nor tomorrow. So we need to send out some very clear messages to Russia that there will be no impunity. But we must never lose sight of peace as a goal and work at defining what fair peace should look like. As soon as you start talking about fair peace, it's a good thing, but we need to agree on a definition. Thank you. Jean-Marie, what do you think civil society can bring to the table in these times of conflict? Well, I was an advisor for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, so an important player for civil societies. I'm now at Columbia University, a professor there. But civil society, well, there's several definitions of what civil society can be. But I believe that the contact, the relationship between human beings over and beyond states that are at war. I mean, this is what is important, the individual relationships. Even though sometimes governments and states are on the back foot. I think if states were to disappear, that would be really a bad thing. In my career, I worked with a lot of countries where the states had failed, and when it fails, you see how important it actually is. But a state that doesn't allow its civil society to breathe and thrive will never be seen as legitimate. The president of Kosovo earlier reminded us how important it is to remember the past and remember history. And I think that people in civil society do it very well, much better than states who want to often rewrite history. If you look at Russia, for example, the Memorial Association, now, unfortunately, today it has been banned, but this association used to play a key role, and it's allowed in many ways Russia to confront its very difficult past under Stalin. And the fact that it was not able or no longer able to do so is something that's quite obvious today, and you can see that society in Russia is moving towards more brutality and more violence. So civil society is key for a society to confront its own truths. And this is why civil society is here more important than states or governments.
10 minutes to give the floor to the audience. So you have to raise your hands, and a microphone will be given to you. So is there any question or intervention, Madame? Yes, he's arriving.
Oui, bonjour. Bonjour. Je m'appelle Oksana.
Hello, my name is Oksana Milichuk. I represent Ukraine. I've got a quick question. Why don't we have a Ukrainian representative on this panel? Because this is a country that has a lot to say under this topic of this panel. Well, over to you then.
Oui, ce que je voulais dire.
Okay, so what I would like to say,
Pour parler de la paix,
when talking about peace
quand vous parlez de la
and
paix en
peace
Ukraine, il faut parler de
in
la paix pour
Ukraine,
l'Europe.
it's important to
Parce
talk
que la
about
guerre
peace
qui est menée entre
for
la Russie et
Europe,
l'Ukraine,
because the
il
war
faut
between
bien
Russia
apprendre,
and Ukraine
il faut enfin
is
commencer à dire que c'est la guerre en
a
Europe,
war
c'est la guerre
in
européenne
Europe
pour les
and a
valeurs
European war,
européennes.
or a
C'est la
war for
guerre
European
entre la
values.
démocratie
It's a
européenne
war
et
between
entre
European
l'autoritarisme
democracy
de tout le monde
and
entier.
the
Parce que du côté de la
authoritarian
Russie, il y a
regimes
l'Iran,
from
il y a Corée
across
du
the world,
Nord,
because
du
there's
côté de
also
l'Ukraine,
Iran,
il y a tout
North
le monde
Korea
civilisé.
backing Russia,
Civilisé, ça
and the
veut
whole
dire le monde
civilized world
qui est
is
entouré,
backing
qui
Ukraine.
vit avec la suprématie du droit.
So
Et le droit
Ukraine is
international,
backed
elle est
by
violée
democracies
crucialement
and
maintenant,
by
aujourd'hui,
international
devant
law.
nous.
International law that's been violated in Ukraine. That's why I don't understand why Ukraine is not sat on this panel. Because when you talk about negotiating with a terrorist, well, look, apologies, all three speakers mentioned Ukraine, mentioned the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We can't have someone from Ukraine on all the panels. But we don't want to negotiate with Putin that we see as a terrorist. We are ready to negotiate with a post-Putin Russia, but not with someone who has committed military crimes and crimes against humanity. We will not negotiate with Putin, and anyone who negotiates with Putin will be endorsing his government and his crimes. I see a lot of hands that have shot up, so we'll give you a microphone.
Oui, bonjour.
Good afternoon, Damitere Utini from Togo. I work for the Research Center,
Je travaille avec le Centre de recherche
Research Center for Information for Disarmament.
On parle plus de la guerre en Ukraine.
Now, we talk a lot about the war in Ukraine. We talk about this conflict more than any other else.
Mais moi, ma difficulté
But,
sur la question de désarmement,
when it comes to disarmament, I'd just like to talk about the fact that Europe is supporting Ukraine with weapons. What kind of controls or checks and balances do we have? Because you said earlier, more weapons to Ukraine. But when these weapons arrive to Ukraine, is it not also a threat to Ukraine? Because we are funding Ukraine through more weapons. Are we not creating a region a bit like Sahel, but in Europe? Because we sent weapons to states in the Sahel region, and then terrorists used these weapons. So are we not making the same mistake?
You want to respond very quickly to have the time to raise other issues?
No, I absolutely believe that these are completely two different circumstances. Ukraine is being sent weapons to defend itself from an aggressor that has violated international law and norms, and Ukraine is acting on self-defense, as it was mentioned earlier before. Ukraine is also protecting all of us. It's protecting all of us from the war to be expanded further within the continent of Europe, which is why by helping Ukraine, we're helping ourselves. We're helping peace and stability in the entire European continent. There's absolutely no proof, no evidence that Ukraine has abused this help so far. Quite the opposite. Ukraine is being successful every single day in winning the war, and as I said, winning it for all of us and winning it for long-term peace and stability. So I don't see any comparison with what you have just mentioned.
Thank you. Another, maybe in this part of the audience?
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour monsieur, bonjour madame, madame, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am a student. I keep an eye on the news like everybody else, and when I look at the General Assembly of the UN, I see that a lot of Asian and African countries do not vote the resolutions that are tabled by European countries to support Ukraine, and they essentially point the finger at European and Western diplomacy and say that they are double standards, that Europe is not doing anything about the war in Yemen, for example. How can we make European diplomacy more consistent and make it more credible?
Merci à vous. C'est un peu the West versus the rest. Jean-Marie, peut-être?
Oui, bon, il y a quand même 143 pays.
Well, there are 143 countries that condemned the aggression. But what about the sanctions? Well, that's another matter. There's one reaction that's quite universal and against the aggression. However, you are right in saying that a lot of countries don't want to get involved in the conflict. There are many reasons behind that. Previously, the world had one large country that was waging war in Iraq and elsewhere. It was not a peaceful world at all. A lot of wars were waged by the Western world, and the US in particular, and the rest of the world remembers that. And I think that yes, we are striving to have a better balance of powers. But for the EU and its defense of certain principles, I think that it's important to show from a practical standpoint that the repercussions of the global economy, which is not just down to the war in Ukraine, but the repercussions that we have with the rise in energy prices, food prices, debt levels that are increasing with higher interest rates. That's going to be a huge problem for a lot of countries. In light of that, the EU needs to have specially tailored policies and to make a financial effort so that these consequences are not too hard for countries to deal with. I think that in public discourse we need also to look at a number of things, because I have worked on many conflicts in the past, and I think that we don't talk enough of conflicts like the ones in Ethiopia, where an agreement has been reached. We don't talk enough about the war in Yemen. We don't discuss enough what happens in Syria at the moment.
À ce qu'on voit en Ukraine avec la destruction systématique.
What was happening now in Ukraine happened a few years ago in Syria. No one is speaking of what happens in the east of in the Congo. So we need to fight for peace, and I think that the Security Council, although it is divided on these topics, I think that there's still some room to go forward. I mean, we haven't even talked about the Central African Republic or South Sudan. These are areas where the Security Council is not completely blocked. We can still do something at the level of the Security Council, and these conflicts we need to indeed put them on the top of the agenda.
But a short question, a very short one, because we have only 1 minute. Madame.
Oui. Cette parole. Alors, je suis.
Thank you very much for giving the floor. Alphonsine Mikuisa. I'm member of a commission for public relations for an association under a platform for Congo-Brazzaville.
Justement, Monsieur Gemma vient de parler
So, you've just talked about civil society. All countries have got civil society, and governments need to put civil society front and center. You talk about aggression on neighboring countries. But sometimes you have governments that attack their own civil society. So this is something that needs to be talked about at UN level. So how can we make progress on this at international level, at UN level, to reinforce civil society? I'm from Congo, Brazzaville, and civil society is being repressed by our own government in this country. We have candidates for the presidential election that have been put in prison. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's the end of today's session. Jean-Marie, maybe quickly, because it was a question on the UN. Can you answer the question? How can the UN protect civil societies from their own governments? Well, that's a big question and a difficult one to answer. Because the UN Charter starts by we, the people, and at the same time it's made up of states, not of people. So when a state goes against the rights of its own people, the UN can't do much. There were some initiatives that were launched to try and find a solution to that, but they're very controversial because they are seen as a way of restoring a neo-colonial kind of relationship. So the UN is there to support peoples around the world, but it's made up of states. And the more there is division between states, the more it becomes difficult for the UN to protect civil society and people. So we need to use UNHCR, we need to use UNDP and the different agencies of the UN to try and protect civil society. That might be a way around the problem that you've just raised. Thank you very much.
Who have taken the floor. It was very stimulating. Thank you very much, Mrs. Osmani. Merci beaucoup, Madame Novak. Merci beaucoup, Jean-Marie. Et donc, on arrête. Le temps est passé. Et suite à tous les débats.
We're going to end it here, and we have a lot to look forward to today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.